the police escalation. The door opened, and this time it wasn't another teacher or administrator stepping through. A police officer filled the frame, uniform crisp, badge catching the fluorescent light. His presence shifted the entire temperature of the room. Hushed whispers from the hall softened, like everyone outside had been waiting for this moment. Up to now, it had been faculty concern and awkward explanations. Now it was procedure. Authority had arrived. The officer crossed the room with deliberate calm, setting a small notebook on the desk before lowering himself into the chair opposite. He didn't rush. Every movement read as measured, like someone used to projecting steadiness during tense situations. And from his job's perspective, anything labeled as an attack plan found on school grounds would raise red flags. Parents and staff might panic in their own ways, but for law enforcement, the protocol was written: investigate as if it were real, no matter how absurd the context. "Sir," the officer began, voice even but heavy, "we need to discuss the files on this device." He shifted the tablet forward an inch and rested his hand near it, leaving a pause that demanded acknowledgement. The father nodded faintly, adjusting his glasses, heart already pounding faster. The officer tapped the screen and opened the list of folders. Each name appeared under the harsh office light: Attack Plan B, Exploit Run Final, Payload Test. He read them aloud in slow sequence, almost theatrically, each term landing heavier than the last. The father cringed at the sound of his own carelessness played back with official weight. What had been sloppy shorthand scribbled at midnight was now evidence under review. "They're familiar?" the officer asked, his tone making the simple question feel sharper than it was. "Yes," the father admitted, keeping his voice steady. "They're part of my job: cybersecurity demos, stress test drills. They're training slides, not instructions." He reached for simplicity, not jargon. The last thing he wanted was to hear himself say payload or penetration test in this room. But even stripped to its basics, his explanation sagged under pressure. "Think of them the way schools run fire drills. Practice versions of problems that don't exist." The words hung there. The officer's brow lifted slightly, not hostile, but unconvinced. He jotted a few quick notes without breaking eye contact. That gesture burned more than any spoken accusation. The officer turned the screen again. A page filled edge to edge with green text and numbers scrolled downward in endless streams. To the father, it was nothing. Random filler code for demonstration, like watching a calculator churn out meaningless equations. But set against the backdrop of a third-grade classroom, he suddenly understood why the teachers reacted the way they had. Rows of undecipherable symbols might as well be an alien transmission to anyone unfamiliar. "What's this meant to be?" the officer asked, his voice flat, probing. He rubbed a hand over his forehead before answering. "Just encryption output. Random characters. It doesn't say anything, it can't. There's no message hidden here." But in that moment, even he understood how poorly the words sounded strung together. Asterisk, randomized codes. Concealed. Nonsense. Asterisk. They were true phrases, but true phrases sometimes only worsen suspicion. He tried again. It's like practice math problems. They don't add up to meaning on their own. Another line scratched into the notebook. Another silence. He wished desperately for the context of a conference room, a projector, a crowd of peers who actually spoke his language. Here, the terminology fumbled like evidence turning in someone else's hands. What gnawed at him most wasn't the misunderstanding itself, it was that the mess had sprung from his own casual habits. Those folder names had been never meant for public eyes, never polished. Attack plan had been a joke to himself, not an actual plan. Exploit was just a placeholder in a sandbox file. Yet carelessness had painted him as something darker. The irony seared in one sharp realization. He had spent years warning clients that vague or sloppy documentation could cause serious confusion. Now he sat facing the direct consequence of it, exposed by his own shortcuts. The officer leaned back, his hands folded over the notebook. His tone softened, but the words still pressed firmly. "You understand how this would appear to anyone unfamiliar." The staff reported real worry. My responsibility is to treat that seriously. And he did understand, at least on some level. To adults standing in front of a room full of children, those words, attack, exploit, payload, weren't technical pointers. They were hazards. Onlookers had acted out of genuine concern, not malice. Still, it didn't drain the sting. Every step of this felt outsized and absurd from his perspective, solvable in seconds if only context were granted. But protocol is slow and deliberate. And paranoia, once sparked, doesn't vanish by explanation alone. Silence lingered again. He sat straighter, willing himself calm. Arguing here would do nothing but carve suspicion deeper. He replayed a familiar principle from his own field. When tension builds and systems falter, the best action is sometimes restraint. Finally, the officer closed the tablet with a softened click and set it aside within reach of his palm. His conclusion came simple and unbent. Until this matter is fully reviewed, the device stays in custody. That phrase landed with unexpected weight. The word custody wasn't just about an object. It dragged permanence behind it. A locked process had begun, one he couldn't rewind or laugh off later. He nodded stiffly, already picturing the fallout, the explanations, the sideways glances, the slippery gossip that feeds quickly in school parking lots. Beyond the walls of that office, whispers were already spreading. And among the crowd, one teacher in particular would soon prove that fear could turn into pure theater if given the right spotlight. But that came later. For now, all he could hear was the echo of that closing phrase: the device remains in custody. The teacher's overreaction. If every school has one teacher who can turn a stubbed toe into a full-scale emergency, this was her stage. She swept into the office, shoulders squared, chin held high, the kind of body language that announced she had uncovered something monumental. The other teachers gave her the floor without contest, happy to let her narrate the event with all the drama she clearly felt it deserved. The father sat still, preparing for what he knew was about to be a performance that would stretch the bounds of reason. She leaned across the table, palms pressed flat as though steadying herself to testify in court. "The moment I saw what your child opened on that screen," she began, pausing for effect, "I knew immediately something was deeply wrong. This wasn't just a folder. This wasn't just a digital assignment. This was something larger." Her words drew out in a rhythm meant for an audience. The names, the symbols. It was as if a government document had been placed in front of second graders. Her voice rose, her breath catching at certain phrases. "I cannot emphasize enough. It looked like dangerous material. Something no child should ever be exposed to." The officer sat silently beside her, face neutral, but his steady nod made the weight of her words hang heavier than before. To her, this was her defining act, the dramatic moment where she had stepped between innocence and threat. For him, sitting opposite, the exaggeration veered into absurdity. Hand-drawn firewall diagrams were being recounted as though they were Cold War cipher sheets. Training slides with cartoon arrows were cast as classified intelligence. He did not interrupt. He simply bent his head slightly, breathing through his nose, letting his silence serve as commentary. Any protest now would only paint him as defensive, and he could already sense that in this room, the story mattered more than the facts. Her gaze flicked down, then back up, as if reliving the scene gripped her more tightly the longer she spoke. The children looked frightened. She continued, "I had to shield the device with my coat, to keep the display hidden until I could get it away. In that moment, I felt responsible, protecting the classroom from a kind of exposure none of us were prepared to face." She pressed her hand to her chest, whispering that she might even need counseling to recover. Around her, a couple of teachers gave slow nods, their faces drawn long with sympathy, as if she had endured something traumatic rather than opened a mislabeled spreadsheet. In the hallway outside, fragments of her words already leaked out. A nearby staffer had lowered her voice to the art teacher, who then passed the tone of alarm toward the lunchroom monitor, who in turn carried fragments into the carpool line. By the time the final bell rang, versions of the story would be bouncing between minivans like an echo chamber, A child had brought classified codes or plans straight into a classroom. The father could see it happening as she spoke, the rumor cycle living and breathing just beyond the office door. Her expression stayed fixed with conviction, which was the part that made it sting. She was not inventing flair. She genuinely believed danger had been intercepted inside her classroom. That unwavering belief, paired with the comical nature of the files, gave her speech its twisted power. Parents watching might have understood. It was the classic intensity a teacher carried for every crisis. A forgotten lunch becomes a story of heroics. A lost sweater turns into a parable about preparedness. Now it was his files carrying the weight of her witness stand delivery. He tried once to explain, careful and slow. He told her the labels were not plans but sample material, teaching tools for training. He used the most stripped-down analogy he could, that they were like mock fire drills, practice for problems that weren't real. But his words landed without traction. Eyes didn't soften. Faces didn't ease. In this room, it wasn't the files being judged anymore. It was him, the one who had created them in the first place. That truth tightened a knot in his chest. To them, it summed up everything, and he knew it would be repeated long after this meeting ended. Colleagues would mention it, parents would rehearse it, neighbors might whisper it. It was a label ready to attach itself to him, regardless of what he said. The officer's pen scratched softly against paper. The others stayed silent, letting the words settle. The teacher finally leaned back, folding her hands neatly, satisfied like a performer who had delivered her climax. Her point had landed, heavy and durable enough to outlast explanation. And now, with that phrase, a hacker's toolkit hanging in the air, the tension inside the office shifted again. What came next would not just be staff whispering or a teacher's dramatic retelling. Something outside the school was now about to pull him further into the tangle. Into the mom and the secrets on the tablet. His phone buzzed again on the desk, and this time the name flashing across the screen was the one he least wanted to see. It wasn't the school, and it wasn't the officer. It was his wife. He hesitated for 2 rings before answering, as though the delay might soften what he already knew was coming. Her voice cut sharp the moment she spoke. "Where's my tablet? Please tell me you didn't send Tommy to school with it." He closed his eyes, guilt weighing heavier than any accusation so far. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "It was closer than his. I didn't realize." Silence followed, but it wasn't the kind that meant forgiveness. He recognized it instantly, the pause before she enumerated exactly how catastrophic this mistake was for their family. When she finally broke it, her tone was flat and clipped. He'd assumed it was just another work machine filled with reports or meeting notes. But the urgency in her voice told him otherwise. "It's not illegal," she said quickly, lowering her voice but not her intensity. "But it's personal. I don't need the principal, the police, or half the PTA flipping through it." His throat went dry. Criminal suspicion he could battle with evidence. Embarrassment, though, that lingered, etched into social memory. It wasn't espionage she was worried about. It was humiliation. Bit by bit, she laid it out. Her tablet wasn't simply a work device. It carried layers of her ordinary private clutter, shopping boards with dream-room furniture, playlist clips she replayed when no one else was home, journals of half-finished private notes. Nothing dangerous. Just fragile things, never meant for other eyes, suddenly exposed in the harshest way possible. He pictured the scene, teachers huddled over the device like they had stumbled upon classified data, scrolling through saved carts of pillows and screenshots of recipes. The image was horrifying and hilarious in equal measure. But for his wife, it was no joke. To her, it wasn't just material, it was reputation. He groaned softly, realizing the real crisis had shifted. Up to this point, he'd been defending sloppy file names and training slides. Now, the real live wire was his wife's digital footprint. His professional pride could survive suspicion. But her secrets, reshaped by staff whispers and parent gossip, would shred them socially before they ever set foot in a boardroom. "I'll make it sound technical." "No," her response was sharp. You don't make it better with tech talk. You'll only make it worse. Just don't. He clenched his jaw, knowing she was right. Rationalizing nonsense already hadn't worked with the officer. Any fumbling explanation about playlists disguised as simulation environments would make them both look absurd. Around him, the office chair felt smaller, his body pressing against its edges. He could handle the thought of police review. The law worked on evidence. But the school system, parents, teachers, they worked on perception. And once teachers believed they'd uncovered something, perception hardened into fact. The thought of one mother whispering in the carpool line, "Did you hear what was on her iPad?" was more terrifying than any formal accusation. It dawned on him that this wasn't just a professional mess or a marriage dispute, it was a full community event. Now, the items on that device had no criminal weight, but the comedic absurdity of them gave the crisis staying power. Out of place, out of context, even basic lists looked theatrical. His wife's playlists were now artifacts. Her shopping collections were evidence. Teachers convinced of danger would see danger even in decoration notes. The harder he thought about that paradox, the worse it became. Police read everything with suspicion. Teachers framed everything with drama. Now she was terrified everything would be turned into gossip fuel. He was stuck in the middle, powerless to rewrite any of it. Her voice broke the silence again, tense but calm enough to carry meaning. "You need to get my tablet back before anyone else looks at it." He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I'll try." The words fell flat. The principal still loomed outside the door, the officer still jotting in his notebook, and the tablet sat sealed in a box like a biohazard container. His wife's demand felt impossible, but refusing wasn't an option. He rubbed his temples, the weight of it pressing harder. This day had started with digital confusion over files. Now, it stretched into personal territory with no easy escape. In his field, evidence spoke louder than speculation. But in this building, speculation ruled, and the evidence, everything from a mislabeled chart to a playlist folder, was only pouring gas on rumor. From the hallway came the familiar sound of the principal's footsteps, firm against tile, moving back toward the office. He knew what that signified. The questions weren't over. Whatever verdict the school felt entitled to deliver was about to arrive. He slid his phone back onto the desk, his wife's clipped words still ringing in his ears. She wanted her privacy intact, her normal habits shielded from the parade of suspicion. But privacy wasn't in his control anymore. It had passed into the hands of people convinced they were handling an emergency. The door creaked open, and all conversation cut back to silence. The officer folded his arms. The principal's expression was heavier now, her posture carrying the air of someone preparing final words. And in that stillness, he realized their roles had shifted. They weren't parents sitting with explanations anymore. They were about to be called back into the room, together, like defendants awaiting judgment. The principal's final judgment. The principal called them back into her office, and the air shifted as soon as they stepped inside. Bright light forced its way in through half-open blinds, chairs placed precisely in front of her desk. No warm welcome, no casual greeting, just formality. She stood behind the desk with an expression trained into stillness, her tone neutral in a way that felt more unsettling than open hostility. She gestured for them to sit, then shuffled through her notes with pointed calm. "Thank you for returning," she began. "We've reviewed the situation carefully." Her phrasing struck him hard. Not accident, not confusion, but situation. That word drew a line, marking the morning as something larger, heavier, almost official. He tried to keep his breath steady. His wife sat rigid beside him, arms crossed, jaw tight. The principal cleared her throat and listed, one by one, the school's main concerns. First, folders with titles that raised alarms, Attack Plan B, Payload Simulation. Second, large volumes of unrelated personal content stored on the device, which disrupted class. And third, unsecured files such as a note literally labeled super secret password. Each phrase fell flat but heavy, clipped into the air like bullet points at a press conference. He caught himself pressing his thumb against his leg, a nervous habit he hadn't felt in years. Words like attack and payload burned back at him. They had been shorthand labels for demo projects, designed to be lighthearted, memorable, never expected to be read by elementary school teachers. Now, they were recast as proof of recklessness. His wife shifted in her chair, but kept her composure. Cheeks warm, chin lifted, she sat without a single word, knowing that replying too quickly would only deepen her mortification. She could already imagine the private browsing folders, the shopping boards, even her collection of saved memes whispered about in staff meetings. For her, the shame was sharper than the scolding. He finally leaned forward, unable to sit silent. Those files were mock-ups. His voice stayed measured, but every word clawed against the walls of the room, straining to bridge the gap between context and perception. The principal barely twitched before moving her eyes back to her notes. Regardless, she said, the language was inappropriate for the school environment. The presence of personal items only compounded the disruption. Her refusal to shift drove frustration deeper into him. He could see her conclusion was already written in the tone of her voice. In her hands, sloppy file names were evidence. Saved cat pictures were disorder. A placeholder password was negligence. No explanation could soften her framing. His wife cracked first. So what we are left with, she said carefully, a voice taut with effort, is our son embarrassed in class and accused over shopping lists, cat folders, and demo slides. The principal did not flinch. The issue, she returned firmly, is that material outside our supervision reached children and faculty. The content itself, combined with its presentation, raised very real alarm. He blinked hard, hearing the detail she couldn't resist adding. The folder with nearly 200 cat pictures. The thought of it cataloged now, as part of a disciplinary report, almost tipped him into bitter laughter. A family folder of feline memes, transformed into official evidence. He pinched the bridge of his nose instead. The absurdity left its mark. Silence stretched. In that pause, the father's frustration softened into resignation. The fight was staged, and logic wasn't the winning argument. He knew too well what families whispered at carpool or in PTA corridors. And once gossip made its rounds, it carried more permanence than any written school note. Finally, the principal folded her hands and spoke with finality. We consider this a serious incident, narrowly avoided from becoming more disruptive than it was. After review, we've chosen a measured consequence. Your son will lose school tablet access for 2 weeks. Lessons will proceed using printed materials during that time. The outcome landed with an anticlimactic thud. No suspension, no extreme sanction. Just a temporary ban on device use. On paper, leniency. But sitting there, they couldn't feel like winners. The weight wasn't in the punishment. It was in the embarrassment now cemented into perception. Their family had been branded, their personal files gossiped about, their private mishaps staged before faculty as a near disaster. His wife's face stayed pale, her lips pressed thin. Relief mixed with the sting of humiliation. At least their son wasn't expelled. But the judgment hung heavy. She could already picture PTA small talk laced with amused pity. He nodded once at the principal, outward calm masking his inward collapse. His whole career had been about closing vulnerabilities, predicting breaches, preventing small mistakes from turning into public failures. And here it was, an accidental tablet swap, a forgotten folder name, and every prepared defense stripped useless against the power of rumor. In the silence, he almost choked on the irony. Carelessness had never cost him more. The principal delivered a closing remark without ornament. This should remind families to handle devices responsibly at home. Polite, general, but aimed squarely at them. The bland phrasing stung more than anger could have. They weren't just corrected, they had been turned into a lesson. A cold handshake ended it. He and his wife rose without words, walking through halls that seemed to shift around them. Teachers looked twice. Staff nodded faintly. Every glance carried its own shade of judgment. Their son, waiting elsewhere in the building, would never grasp the scene's full scope. He would return to math problems and recess while his parents carried the invisible verdict pressed upon them. By the time they stepped outside, the midday light didn't feel like relief. It felt like another stage. And heading home together, they both knew the official ruling wasn't the hardest part. What lingered wasn't punishment. It was the fallout waiting for them away from this building, where no principal could moderate how the story spread. Family fallout and the ridiculous aftermath. The house was silent when they stepped back inside. Jackets landed on hooks, shoes scattered across the entry mat, and the tension that had stayed contained in the principal's office came spilling out. There were no administrators here, no officers, just the two of them, with the argument they had both been holding back since morning. She struck first. Her voice wasn't loud, but sharp in a way he knew meant real anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" He set the tablet on the counter as if surrendering it, hands lifted, already ready to defend himself. "It was a rush," he said flatly. "I grabbed the closest tablet. That happens." Her arms folded, her head tilted, and she shot back instantly. Grabbing the wrong jacket happens. Sending a kid with old homework happens. This was different. You handed my entire private life to a classroom. She didn't need volume. The precision of her words cut deeper. His son broke the tension minutes later by bouncing into the room, Spider-Man backpack still strapped tight, face glowing as if the day had been the most exciting of his life. "Mom, Dad, school went crazy," he announced, breathless with enthusiasm. "My teacher covered the tablet with her coat like it was a monster. And then the police came." His hands clapped together in glee. Best day ever. He spun once before racing toward the couch, humming victory music only he could hear. The parents didn't answer. Their son had no idea he was dropping commentary into what felt to them like the wreckage of their entire reputation. She pulled the tablet to herself, flipping open folders, scrolling through pages like a forensic investigator counting fractures. Her lip curled slightly with each discovery. She whispered, "They saw my saved cards." They saw the folders labeled projects that were just crafts stacked in drafts. They saw 17 playlists. They saw all of it. She snapped the cover shut hard. "Do you realize what it feels like to know every teacher will look at me and picture all this?" He tried to contain a laugh at the words that slipped out next. "It's not clutter if they all think I'm hoarding mugs." The phrase lingered in the air until even she smirked reluctantly. He knew better than to laugh openly, so he let the absurdity sit between them, a pressure valve on her fury. Their son called from the couch, still narrating, then Mrs. Taylor almost fainted. "Everyone stared at me like I was a superhero." His voice carried pure delight. For him, the chaos was glory. For them, it was humiliation. The contrast knotted into a bitter kind of comedy, his pride in what they called disaster. Arguments circled quickly after. She pressed him about his labels. Why name files like that? Who calls something attack plan B and assumes it's safe? He snapped back about her tablet. Why keep private notes and screenshots everywhere with no lock? They volleyed between the two mistakes, his careless file names, her unguarded folders. They weren't wrong about each other, and the truth only sharpened the sting. At one point, he tossed his hands into the air. "Fine, I was optimizing workflows for parenting." The phrase sounded so ridiculous in the kitchen it broke them both. Anger cracked into laughter, short bursts they couldn't suppress. She shook her head, still annoyed. "You don't optimize a child like server traffic," she said. But her smile betrayed her. The more they replayed the day, the less it looked like a crisis, and the more it resembled a farce. Grown adults panicking over cat folders. Teachers treating a shopping list like suspicious data. A note that said, "super secret password," being treated with the gravity of a security breach. Each remembered absurdity pushed them closer to laughter. They leaned over the kitchen counter, exhausted but grinning through it. Still, the weight pressed on them both. She leaned back finally, voice soft but edged with dread. "Every PTA fundraiser, every hallway, I'll feel their eyes." He nodded, eyes shut, a half smile tugging at him anyway. And what exactly will they remember? Candle jars, playlists, and mug collections. The ridiculousness oddly steadied them, even as it underlined how their reputations had taken a hit. The boy pirouetted into the kitchen again, arms wide. "Everyone was talking about me." I'm famous now." He shouted the word famous like it was the best prize school could hand him. They groaned together, but couldn't fight their smiles. Of course, he didn't care about files or folders. To him, the day had been pure spectacle. Eventually, they sat slumped, half laughing, half sighing. He let the silence fill before breaking it in the only way he knew. "New rule," he said firmly. "No more devices in backpacks unless we've checked. Paper, pencils, crayons. Nothing with Wi-Fi leaves this house again." He paused. "That way, we avoid becoming tomorrow's security drill." She raised an eyebrow, lips twitching. "Until the day he forgets a worksheet and you replace it with classified blueprints." That jab cracked them both into another round of laughter, softer this time, easier. The tension thinned, replaced by the kind of exhausted humor families cling to when the storm has passed. They carried that strange blend upstairs later, a mixture of lingering shame and shared amusement. Their son kept humming like a hero in a story. His parents carried the knowledge that gossip had already taken shape in the community. But as they locked up for the night, they found themselves laughing again, quieter, the sound bouncing lightly in the hallway. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was enough to feel the edges soften, to recognize there was still room for humor in what, hours ago, had felt like collapse. And that laughter, jagged as it was, carried them just far enough to face what the next day would bring. Because in the end, the exhaustion, the humor, and the ridiculousness of their fallout had formed something they both understood. Sometimes what feels like disaster doesn't end as tragedy. It lingers as legend. And the real weight isn't in what happened, but in how the family remembers it. The moral hidden in the meltdown. There's a strange clarity that comes after a family disaster settles, when the noise fades but the lesson stays loud in your head. This was one of those days. On the surface, it had been about a tablet, a mess of mislabeled files, and a police officer flipping through folders never intended for daylight. But at its core, the meltdown carried its own moral, one that wasn't about rules or security, but about how messy life with kids becomes no matter how careful you are. For the father, the irony hit hardest. He had built digital fortresses for years, advising companies with million-dollar budgets on how to avoid catastrophe. He knew better than anyone that disaster doesn't come from the obvious weaknesses, but from the overlooked details. And yet, in his own house, one scuffed iPad case and an impatient breakfast rush toppled the entire structure. The cereal spill, the mix-up, the careless folder names, they undid more than any hacker could have. Sitting there later, he couldn't decide whether to laugh or groan. Maybe both. His wife found her lesson in a different place. She didn't care about firewalls or irony. She cared about the humiliation of watching her private notes and candle shopping lists pass through the hands of teachers and administrators who assumed they had found secrets. The sting was personal, but even she admitted, with a quiet laugh at the kitchen table, that the whole spectacle had turned into a kind of comedy sketch. And if people were going to judge, they were judging over mood boards and recipe screenshots. Of all the scandals to carry, this might be the most harmless. The boy, of course, never saw disaster at all. For him, it was victory. He had made adults panic. He had seen teachers whisper, officers arrive, parents look stunned, and it all revolved around him. He slid beneath the covers that night with a grin bolted onto his face, convinced he had found his moment of glory. Tomorrow, he would be the student telling the wildest story at recess. A second grader hacking his school with a stray iPad? For him, that was legend status achieved. His parents dreaded the rumors he'd carry into class, but watching him beam with pride, they realized the moment was lost to him forever. This wasn't shame. This was his badge. Looking at their son's grin, both parents understood something simple but sharp. Parenting isn't about controlling every variable. There will always be mornings when backpacks get mixed up, when the wrong file ends up in the right hands, when reputations flicker under fluorescent lights. The only real choice they had was how to handle it afterward. And in their house, handling it meant finding humor in humiliation. That became the moral hidden in the meltdown. You can prepare for everything. Lock devices, rename files, label backpacks, but life with children will find its way to chaos. The strength isn't in perfection. It's in laughing off what looks catastrophic in the morning once you've survived it by night. Families don't run on airtight defenses. They run on resilience, on the ability to take even the most bruising embarrassment and turn it into a story everyone rolls their eyes at later. The day proves something both parents needed to see. That worst-case scenarios don't always stay disasters. Sometimes they shrink into comedy. Sometimes the humiliation bonds you more than the victories do. The father had been undone by serial and sloppy file names. The mother carried the sting of unwanted eyes browsing her shopping boards. And the son carried nothing but a legend he would repeat with glee. Each carried a different piece of the meltdown, but together it formed one narrative, that failure doesn't have to fracture. In its strangest way, failure is what glues family memory together. Because no one forgets the nights spent laughing at disasters that once made you panic. So when parents watching reflect on this story, maybe it's not about iPads or schools at all. Maybe it's about how we all stumble. Every family has a day that feels like collapse in the moment, only to be retold as a punchline. Who here has a story like that? A parenting fail you swore would ruin you, but instead became the family anecdote that always gets laughs? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear them. This was never about losing control permanently. It was about discovering a kind of resilience you can't fake. Resilience that turns the sting into a chuckle, chaos into story, shame into humor. And that's not just a lesson, it's survival, the quiet way families move forward. And what surprised them most as the day ended was how quickly the pain had bent into something almost funny. What they thought would crush them instead gave them another story to stack on the shelf, another punchline waiting to be retold. Because when you can laugh, even at the messiest, most humiliating chaos, you realize something important. You've already won by surviving it. And in the rhythm of family life, those disasters don't haunt you forever. They turn into the stories you keep alive. Sometimes the worst family tech mistakes don't end in ruin. They stick as the kind of story everyone in the house keeps retelling. What looked like chaos in the morning folded into legend by night. Life with kids isn't about flawless order. It's about the missteps that become the loudest memories. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop one sentence in the comments. What's the funniest tech mix-up your kid ever caused? And if you've ever lived through a PTA panic, hit the like button. We survived ours. Tommy's a legend, and I'll never live down Attack Plan B.